we had done with Nunzio's presentation. He presented his book, who was a much more condensed, robust theory. This paper, as Nuria has advanced, it's an ongoing paper because Professor Luigi Caranti, who is my coordinator, he's organizing a special issue about Dario Mollendorf's latest book, which calls Mobilizing Hope. It's a very recent book on climate justice, so I have prepared a paper, or I have to prepare by the end of the last month, next month, about some ideas that contradict some other ideas that Dario Mollendorf introduced. And what is the spirit of this paper? Because Mollendorf's last book focused too much on what normally we see as the progressive and emancipatory social movements like Fridays for Future, like Extinction Rebellion, like the Last Generation. So he has in mind always those progressive emancipatory social movements. And I think that if we enlarge a little bit what is going on the social sphere, the public sphere of liberal democracy, especially in Europe, we can see a much more enlarged picture, which is not always so much progressive or so much emancipatory. So I wanted to bring the things a little bit more conflictive, and I think it's a good thing also from the normative political theory and for climate justice especially, to enlarge the climate disagreements that are going on. So this is the spirit, and I will move to the outline of my presentation. I have prepared more or less 4 very general parts. In the first part, I try to be more empirically and work about what is I will pressure to beyond the one-sided narrative and a larger view on climate disagreements. In the second part, I will talk a little bit more about public sphere and its role in liberal democracies. In the third part, I will bring a more conflicted framework of public sphere into climate justice, which I think is one thing that is really missing in normative theories about climate justice. And last point is about to bring some practical implications, especially in the context of the European Union. And so let's go to the first part and pressure a little bit more to enlarge what we have in mind when we talk about climate disagreements. As I already have advanced to you, when we talk about social movements, mobilization of hope in liberal democracies and public sphere, we have those groups in mind. Again, Fridays for Future, Last Generation, Extinction Rebellion. And usually we have that image in mind, young people talking about, for example, talking about pro-climate policies, pro-climate very ambitious policies. Also, they focus too much a lot in the intergeneration importance of a rapid and ambitious path towards the green transition. But beyond this general idea, this general, let's say, phenomenon, I think, however, other narratives have been raised and are contesting this narrative on the fight against climate change. In particular, as far as I see, a wave of counter-examples against ambitious climate policy and the green transitions has been attracting attention, and most importantly, they also have been mobilizing people recently, both on the digital platform and also in the street. So, for example, let's take in consideration very briefly 3 examples. The first case, for example, perhaps is the most paradigmatic counter-example that we have in mind when we think the contrary adversary of climate for futures, which are the climate skepticism or climate denialist groups. So it's a completely extreme what we usually think about the climate protests. Who are those people or those groups usually? Well, if we look to the most updated works on climate science, they they construct several categories of who are those climate skeptics or denialists. For example, they can be people which is skeptical denialists about the scientific evidence, about the evidence of science. They can be the skeptics or denialists, not the evidence, but about the process which these scientific studies have been done. Or they can be another kind already of skepticism or denialism, which is what they call response skepticism. That in fact, there are people that are skeptical of the individual or the mainly in the political capability of institutions to check this climate crisis serious. So we have this kind of movement. The second case to have in mind is also the recent EU farmers in 2023 and 2024. Different from that kind of narrative, which was mainly denialist, this one is more obstruction because they think, for example, that an ambitious climate policy and the green transition do not take seriously those people, those burdens that farmers, for example, will have to take for saving the future, as they say, and to save the planet. So for them, they call their attention that how much it was too much cost for them to be engaged in a climate transition process. And the list that is the yellow jacket process in 2018, perhaps is the most largest one. That, as you know, when President Macron tried to implement a broader ecological transition pathway to reduce the carbon emissions, he decided to affect too much the price of the fossil fuel, the diesel fuel, and this raised this enormous giant protest in 2018 in France. So let's say what I have said is that beyond the Friday for Futures, we have a lot of different kinds of climate disagreements going on. And myself as a political philosopher working with climate justice, I have this impression that political scientists, sociologists have been including much more attention than us to this plural and conflict landscape of climate disagreement. But interestingly, political philosophy and climate justice have little explored them. In fact, as I say in the slide, political philosophers and climate justice scholars usually concentrate on the two extreme sides. On the one hand, the pro-climate intergenerational policies movements like Fridays for Future, and the other extreme, the climate skeptics and denials. So the way how they build the geography of the problem seems that or you are a younger pro-intergenerational emancipatory one, or you are a climate denial specialist. There is nothing in the between. My point or my intuition is that those things, those disagreements, climate disagreements that happen, the in-between, as emphasized here, they are irrelevant, and we have something to say, and we can learn normatively about this kind of phenomena. So this is what the first part of my presentation. Now I will bring more the potentially concepts from political philosophy that can help us to think more about how to problematize this point and move forward. So sorry if I'm running a little bit. So let's move to the second part, which is public sphere and its role in liberal democracies. As probably all you know about the famous philosopher that in the last decades bring the idea of public sphere, which is Jürgen Habermas. He was very important that because beyond the official political forum and the reduced and mere technocratic view on who should deliberate in liberal democracies, Habermas' concept of the public sphere was path-breaking in the contemporary defense. In particular, his deliberative model of liberal democracy must be constituted of this space of discussion, argumentation, and circulation of ideas among citizens, what he calls the public sphere. Well, in Habermas, as a political philosopher, he does not just describe the public sphere in a descriptive sociological perspective, as I'm showing. That is, Habermas describes the public sphere, of course, as a space where ordinary citizens can exercise their communicative and declarative acts for the sake of purpose of debating and potentially changing attitudes. But always, for a political philosopher, this public sphere is also a normative concept. What does it mean? It means that the public sphere aims at a public space where citizens could interact communicatively and deliberate as free and equal persons in liberal democracy, in particular about the public issues that are mostly concerning us, like the green transition, for example, which is perhaps one of the most important things that have been discussed and must be discussed if we want to keep the agreement of the Paris Agreement. So, but as also I believe you know, because this debate is very well know it, Habermas had suffered many criticism about how he has imagined this normative conceptualization of public sphere. Just to go very quickly, first and most criticism, he has too much idealized what the public sphere is and should be. He had in mind, for example, such a 18th century bourgeois public sphere society where the public cafes and all these modernization public spaces like the Madrian cafes and tabernas where people go to discuss the main what they concern in public then. So the first, the most criticism and the historical idealization of what the public sphere is. The second one is very famous, is about the exclusion and inequality criticism. Here we have most the feminists, Iris and Marianne as phrased, who have criticized that Habermas' conceptualization of public sphere does not capture too much well the real world dynamics and inequalities. Inequalities in a larger sense, not just economic, but also political, cultural, social. And those inequalities and those differences of political power really undermine the communicative acts. Let's move further. The third famous criticism is his overemphasis on a rational debate criticism, as for example, again, principally, mainly Chantal Mouffe have called attention the idea of a rational deliberation, a rational communication among citizens. The public sphere is not so rational choice or so much rationally, logically made, but it's always crossed by dispassionate debate, emotions, aesthetic performativity, etc. And the last but not least criticism that I'm bringing here, which I really like, and it's also very problematic, but I really decided to introduce here, is the idea of the counterpublic criticism. What does it mean? According to this objection, as you can see, Habermas had focused on a very singular and unified view of the public sphere. However, as Nancy Fraser pointed out decades ago, there are multiple completing narratives in response of exclusion and subordination of the dominant narrative that usually is already institutionalized in the social orders. So I like the idea of counterpolitics on one hand because this gives a dynamics in the public sphere about the, as you can see, the dominant publics, which are normally those publics that are the narratives that are usually already institutionalized and already closer to the narratives of the state, the capital and the size. But on one hand, we also have the idea of counterproducts, who are those narratives and groups who advocate a completely counter position in relation to the dominant. So what's the point here? Of course, after we go back to the literature, Nancy Fraser had in mind those feminist, black and queer counterpublics which, however, in the current literature, especially the political science literature, have been calling attention for a more neutral conception of counterpublics. And why they do this? This is because not all counterpublics, as we saw in our first three examples, are necessarily guided by emancipatory narratives, or they are themselves subaltern minorities. This is the case, for instance, of some of the examples that I show in the first mark of the presentation. So in this renewed counterpublic and public sphere literature, both left-wing and also right-wing narratives can be part of the counterpublics, and they have also a role to play in liberal democracies. At least those literature in climate political science, they call attention a lot to this disruptive role of counterpublics. Especially this disruptive role is more functionalistic much more a normative one about how things should be. So what they say about this disruptive role of counterpublic is, according to this renewed conception, as you can see, they have the explicit role of confronting the state and the established institutional order and narratives. And the idea is to create a disruption role in liberal democracy. In doing so, they seek to put in circulation necessary narratives of opposition against those perceived and institutionalized as dominant, intentionally causing reactions of shock and disturbance in what is perceived as given in the social order. So, up to now, of course, I will pass too much here because we have many other valuable criticisms to Habermas, limited the view of the public sphere. It does not consider well-being need and social platforms. However, he tried to do it in last year book. He does not consider the effects on the communication deliberation in neoliberal forms, and also the decolonial fears have been calling attention that perhaps this model is very idealized for for Western society, so it will be very limited to tackle being in non-Western and the global South and the influence of colonialism and this. But I will stop here right now because I will go to the all that I have already talked about what it's concerning me, and I bring the potential fear that can help us to frame the climate disagreement in a more sophisticated way. Now I will try somehow to bring the things more together and intricate them. So the third part of my presentation is bringing a more conflicted framework of public sphere into climate justice. So I will try to argue, or what I want to try to argue in my paper, for example, is that by entangling a more conflicted literature on the role of the public sphere within climate justice, perhaps we can have a much more complex normative framework to tackle climate disagreements and liberal demands today. So just to recall here, the basic definition of climate justice I take, and usually is taken the Rawlsian side about how to understand, like for example, McKenna and Elizabeth Christ, and the way how they normally usually conceptualize climate justice, as you can see, is climate justice mainly concerns about the normative investigation of the distribution, a fair distribution of the burdens and the benefits associated with the green transition of the social order. Who will be benefited, who will must take much more burdens to doing this, according to which principles and which kind of resources we are talking about here. So climate justice in this very general framework, it's about fair distribution of burdens and benefits associated with such an ambitious project like the green transition. But my point here is climate justice can be compatible with a technocratic paradigm of liberal democracy. Indeed, as the Habermas-Rawls debate explored decades ago, even in fact, even a technocratic paradigm of liberal democracy can be committed to climate justice and achieve climate policies based on a justification according to such normative investigation, at least theoretically or at least prima facie. It's analytically as possible to be combined. It's technocratic paradigm of liberal democracy with climate justice. And in doing this, you can leave, for example, the ordinary citizens' deliberation in the public sphere as something not unnecessary or something that should not be a constitutive part of the decisions about the green transition. But my point is, why must we pursue still a deliberative model in climate justice instead of a merely technocratic paradigm of liberal democracy? Well, let's say that contrary to such a technocratic paradigm of liberal democracy, a deliberative defense is much more better to capture what's going on in those those climate dissents, in those climate conflicts, because first they can capture better the dissent, the figure about the climate dissent, because they are disputing narratives about how those burdens and benefits should be distributed among citizens. And also from a normative perspective, they are not just important to enlarge what the narratives and agendas and projects about green transition is, but always they bring a very important thing for a conception, a most, let's say, a most comprehensive conception of climate justice. And here I mention what Halls, for example, have in mind about the role of climate justice. It's not about to have it validate, to build the normative validity of the public justification. For example, climate justice must have a word to say what kind of public justifications to the green transitions or ambitious climate policies can be said valid from the moral point of view. But also, this is just one step, very important step to do by climate justice. But the second part is also very important, because you can have a morally sophisticated public justification, but this morally valid public justification cannot gain validity, legitimacy, or acceptability of those climate policies and those green transitions in the public sphere. So I think that, for example, the climate justice literature, and here I'm talking about my colleagues and scholars in political philosophy, they are looking too much to discussion the validity of the public justification of ambitious climate policies and the green transition, and they look much more less or little exploring the questions of the legitimacy of public policy. And here we have a completely different scenario, because, for example, think again about Macron's proposal on building a much more increased and high taxes on the diesel and fossil fuel. People went to the street, even if they are not necessarily climate denialists or skeptical, they went to the street against this, because for them it was too much burden. Even then, let's say the end could be good in the long run for future people, for future societies, but now people are already indicating those kind of validity of public justifications as not legitimate. They do not accept. So proper climate justice conception, I believe, must move between these two movements. And when we talk about legitimacy, we have to talk about people going to the public sphere and debating very, let's say, very hard and very conflicted about who should pay, how much should pay, how should be distributed, and And that's this point. So here, by bringing public debate, decent, and the democratic scrutiny into the heart of the green transition, counterpublics can help ensure that the deliberative process is not only effective, let's say from a technocratic point of view, but also just and democratically accountable, and that's set by them. And that's a very big challenge to make people who probably who has to accept much more extreme burdens to be able to respect the Paris Agreement targets in less than 10 years. They have to accept by themselves, let's say, that they have to pay too much or to be much more burdened in comparison to generations before them. But it's a very critical thing that a technocratic paradigm will not find, I think, stability necessary to have the people to accept this. So let's move to the next part. In this one, I believe that a more entangled framework can be valuable for at least three reasons. First, it can provide a normative framework that does aim at an unified static view of the public sphere in liberal democracy. Again, a view that is not focused on Fridays for Future. In doing so, it makes available a more dynamic and conflicting understanding of the struggle over narratives over the fight against climate change and also the green transition. Secondly, it can provide a normative framework that does not interpret the mere existence of counterpublics as intrinsically pernicious or necessarily bad to the fight against climate change, but rather some of them might be considered reasonable plans. Again, the yellow jacket protests. First, and also can provide a normative framework that stresses in the public sphere to challenge those top-down and technocratic political decisions regarding the green transitions by giving voice to those citizens perceived themselves as marginalized or excluded from these dominant narratives or from the dominant spaces where the political agenda and the political decisions are top-down chosen. So let's just to finish. In fact, now we can think about some practical implications, especially in the case of the EU contest. So I will not I will not talk about here the United States situation, not the Latin America situations, because as you said, we have now Trump and we have a much more complicated situation in Latin America. So I will, for the sake of conclusions, just to concentrate in the European context. So since the counterpublics can test the validity and the legitimacy of climate policies by bringing public debate, dissent, and democratic scrutiny into the heart of the green transition, so we can now return to ask, do we have some reasons to be concerned about the way things are going recently? I do not think that we are going in a very good path, because usually, we come back to those examples that I have mentioned, the farmer protest example last year, or the yellow jacket, interestingly, even if ordinary people, citizens, go to these protests, they are not necessarily skeptical or denialist about climate change. They have been usually coopted by the far right-wing parties like AfD in Germany, like, for example, the Lega and the Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, and also another parts of the European scenario. So if we do not stop this, and we not enlarge our view of climate disagreements, both for a descriptive side, which let's say that political science already has been doing, but political philosophy and climate justice, in my reading of the literature, they are not doing. Let's say that we are somehow helping to things go in this direction. For example, I brought those two very nice, very concerning fact news. that was recently revealed that some US climate denial groups have been working within European far right parties in the European Commission. And also here it was analysis about climate crisis leaves European farmers all very vulnerable to the far rights in the campaigns. For example, as I said, in Italy, at least the the Lega and the Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia, they won I think the most important parties that were aligned to them and have joined them those discussions. So I believe that we have good reasons to be concerned about these practical implications, and somehow I think my intuition, normative intuition, has some important things to say. Why? Now, because those, for example, those cases that I mentioned, they have been contesting the most dominant progressive narratives and perceptions in favor of climate policies. But in addition, as I already said, the contest has usually been very entangled with far-right political ideologies. And furthermore, they have been coopted and financed by the far-right political parties and think tanks. So as a consequence, it seems that we have some reasons to be concerned about this phenomenon, in particular due to the fact that it has a strong potential to gain more influence on the public perception about the fight against the climate change and the green transition. So that was my take. As you can see, it was not a very robust argument description, but I will be very happy to hear about you, at least the way how I construct the problem looks like feasible, looks like something feasible for you, and if it's feasible, if political philosophy and climate just to take more seriously their narrative and bring much more in climate just a more deliberative paradigm, which is much more open to the public sphere and their more conflictive disagreements. So thank you, and thank you again for Clara, and sorry again that I did not send you earlier. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. It was we are pleasure to hear you. I found